Okay, good morning, everyone. We are on day 3 of our biannual research colloquium. Thank you for your attendance. We know that everyone has a busy schedule, and showing up for these sessions and supporting your faculty, your peers, sometimes it's even students and other individuals within our organization who can present at these colloquia. And today's focus for both sessions will be human trafficking, but they're coming at the issue through different perspectives because of their different disciplines. And so our first presenter is Dr. Angela Holzer, and Angela's topic is using nonprofits as a source to hopefully minimize human trafficking. So Dr. Holzer, I will just turn it over to you and let you begin.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So as mentioned, the topic that this presentation will be circling around nonprofits, entitled Fighting Human Trafficking by Better Understanding Nonprofit Collaboration. So there are 5 learning objectives for this presentation. First, to better understand human trafficking. Second, see the benefits of collaboration. Third, really understanding the landscape of the nonprofit sector in the US. Fourth, understanding the challenges that these nonprofits face as they collaborate. And then 5th, I want to introduce you to a new solution to help the nonprofit sector in their efforts. So just a little bit about me. I received my undergraduate degree in psychology, minoring in German. I have a master's degree in educational counseling, grade levels K through 14. And then I recently did receive my doctorate degree in education in leadership and learning, specializing in organizational leadership, where I really emphasized my research in the nonprofit sector. So the last 20 years, really, I have spent my professional life in the nonprofit sector. I started out working at the Boys and Girls Club in Greater Salt Lake as a program director, where I worked with the at-risk youth, ages 5 to 13. And this is where I learned a lot about poverty, abuse, and neglect, and the importance of collaborating and working with social workers to help these kids. I then moved to San Francisco Bay Area, where I became a school counselor. I worked with the at-risk youth from 13 to 18 years old. Here is where I learned a lot about prevention, education programs, and the importance of working with law enforcement, as we did see suicide prevention elements as well as homelessness. I then accepted a position in Reach the Children, working as the International Development Director. I ran an HIV/AIDS prevention program in Africa. This is where I learned a lot about orphan care, exploitation, and the importance of working with schools, local NGOs, and the Ministry of Education in different countries. So this really led to the founding 10 years ago of a nonprofit, GivenTree, where we supported quality small nonprofits through fundraising, resources. We even provided medical teams that we brought over to these different locations that I listed. And then I recently founded Wiki Charities, which you'll hear about at the end of this presentation. And this was really led by my research that I'll be presenting today in human trafficking. We'll be piloting this platform this year in the US. And then I currently work at Stanford teaching yoga and meditation. I work through the Stanford School of Medicine, where I received my certification in mental health, and I specialize in trauma-informed yoga. And then just my interests, of course, around yoga and meditation. I play the guitar, the piano, and I've recently picked up painting. This is a picture on the bottom part of the screen here of a woman that I met a few years ago in Mozambique, which for me is very symbolic of the importance of working together to really include diversity as we collaborate for greater purposes. So this presentation is based on my dissertation from last year, entitled Similarities and Differences in How Nonprofits Collaborate in Fighting Human Trafficking in 2 Different Communities. So I chose the San Francisco Bay Area, 4 counties in this area, which is where I'm based right now. And then I also chose the Salt Lake City area, 4 counties in this state, which is where I was born and raised. So I'm very familiar with both of these communities. So the need for this study really circles around the statement of the problem. So first, there is a problem with the rising number of victims in human trafficking globally. That's from a 2019 report. And then 2, there is a need to improve collaboration between nonprofit organizations and the community in order to help these victims more effectively. So the background of the research, I'll start with a brief overview of human trafficking. So in the United States, our laws really start in the year 2000 when the first federal law was passed called the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This approach at the time, they had a 3P approach: prevention, prosecution, protection. 9 years later, they added an additional P for partnerships. They recognized the importance of working together to fight this issue. There was a 2018 research study that showed that there is minimal evidence to show that nonprofit organizations are partnering voluntarily with state agencies in fighting human trafficking. So what is the definition of human trafficking? I thought it was important to read the actual definition. This is from a 2004 United Nations report. It's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So oftentimes you see this definition broken down into 3 different areas, which I listed below. First, forced labor or services. Second, sexual exploitation. And third, the removal of organs. So in the United States, we really focus on the first 2. So I wanted to briefly give you examples of each of these 2 areas in the areas that I researched. So California, you can look at this on the news. It's called the Rainbow Bright Daycare case. This is where owners forced hundreds of Filipino immigrants to take care of adults and children in care centers. And they estimate 8.5 million wages were withheld. And then in Utah, we do have a presence of the polygamous groups, which could potentially be child labor trafficking. This is where we've seen 10-year-old boys, for example, working many hours in family-run businesses that surpass the legal limit, and often these boys are not paid. So this could be considered child labor trafficking. And then with sexual exploitation, 2 examples. We see parents selling children for sex to get money. We also see landlords requiring sex from women who cannot pay their rent, and we've seen this during the pandemic. So using the chat box, I would love for you to answer, how many people in the world do you think are currently in human trafficking, which is also known as modern day slavery? So I'll just take a minute. I can open the chat box from here, go in, and I'll give you a hint, it's in the millions. So how many do you think are actually in modern day slavery now? Someone said 4 million. Any other guesses? 5 million, 10 million, 30 million. I'll take one more if you have it. Okay, that's right. All right, so I'm gonna move to the next slide. So we actually take our estimates from a report from the International Labor Organization from a 26 report. And this is the most trusted report that we have. They estimate 40.3 million people are in modern day slavery throughout the world. And this shows that almost 25 million are in forced labor, over 15 million are in forced marriage, also considered part of sexual exploitation. And in the center here, I did note that from a 2019 report, they guesstimate from the 40 million, a quarter of them are children. Now, if we look at the United States, there's an estimated 50,000 people that are trafficked in the US each year. Most come from Mexico and the Philippines. And in 2018, over 51% of the criminal human trafficking cases active in the US were sexual trafficking cases involving only children. And then I did want to look at, from the National Human Trafficking Hotline in the US, the 2 areas that I did my research in, California and Utah. In 2019, there were 1,507 cases reported in California. In Utah, there were 90 cases. So we do see that in California is one of the worst places for human trafficking, but really as a comparison, I wanted to show per capita of the population of these cases that were reported. And if there were an additional 30 cases in Utah, so 120, it would be the same per capita. And I say that because I think it's important for people to recognize that human trafficking is happening everywhere throughout the United States. So the literature of the topic, there were 3 areas of interest in this study that I researched. nonprofits, the nonprofit sector, collaboration, and human trafficking that I'll touch on. So the nonprofit landscape in the United States, there's an estimated 1.9 million nonprofits in the US. So as you see by this graph, 1.5 million of these nonprofits are registered, and the Nonprofit Almanac guesstimates another 400,000 nonprofits or charities are not registered in the United States. Now, these nonprofits are not required to be registered if they make under $50,000 a year. So as you see here, 82% of these nonprofits working in our communities are small. Now, these are nonprofits making under $1 million. If we were to break this down even further, the majority would be making under 200,000, possibly even 100,000. So these are often really small nonprofits working in these efforts. Now, from a 2013 study, it did really focus on nonprofits and agencies that helped victims of human trafficking. And there were two elements I wanted to pull from this research. First, they showed that most agencies were not aware of each other within a community. And second, most agencies found out about each other through word of mouth. So you can see during this pandemic, the importance of figuring out different ways to really help them know about each other. And then in a 2015 study, it did show that there is a gap in documentation on how nonprofits collaborate within the communities. Now, as I looked at collaborations from a 2011 study, scholars do not agree on one definition of collaboration. There are different ways to describe collaboration here, as I've shown: partnerships, alliances, agreements, consortia, coalitions. There's also different ways to collaborate, different ways to communicate, cooperate. Even sharing of resources and information could be different. So the definition I used in my research was the collaboration is a method that can be used either formally or informally by a group of individuals who can work side by side to share concerns that can bring mutual gain. Now, there were 6 words here I really wanted to emphasize: who can work side by side. Now, in a recent conversation I had with Sergeant Juan Reveles, he's in the Anaheim Police Department. He runs the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force. This is one of the leading task forces in the nation. He did emphasize several times, this is a people-based effort, not a systems-based effort. We cannot run this by machines. We can't prescribe exactly what to do in every situation. He said this work is a lot about intuition. We need to learn to get along, and different groups think differently. So as you see this pie chart, I did pull this from their report, from a 29 report. They take a collaborative model. They call it a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. And as you can see, they really involve every aspect of the community. Oftentimes, nonprofits are also referred to as victim services. But it is important that as we run into differences, even strained relationships within these communities and cultures, it's important to push through those for the benefit of the victims. So when we look through collaboration, in my research, I found 7 benefits of collaboration. First, outcomes are improved when we collaborate. Second, new opportunities are presented. 3, new information is presented. And I would say oftentimes this is because we think differently. 4, new social capital is available. And then 5, from a 2018 study, greater connections within the community exist when we collaborate. And then 6 and 7, more access to funds and more access to resources. So when we see sharing of resources, this could also involve pooling or sharing finances, skills, expertise, staffing, and knowledge for a collaborative purpose. However, we also need to acknowledge that there are challenges in collaboration. So this is specifically with nonprofit organizations and the research that I found. There are 6 different challenges. First, these nonprofits have limited time, or they believe they have limited time, so they don't collaborate. 2, limited resources. 3 and 4, competition and lack of trust. So this happens within the nonprofit sector and with public and private sectors. And then 5 and 6 really address the smaller nonprofits. This is where we see small nonprofits being dissolved when they collaborate, and they often lose autonomy. So we see larger nonprofits being the decision makers. They are the ones that really run these collaborative networks, and these smaller nonprofits are left behind and often not included. And then with human trafficking, we do see a very limited number of human trafficking studies out there. However, the current studies are attempting to describe and explain elements of human trafficking. So potentially prevention elements or aftercare services, things that are needed. So these research methods are improving. However, human trafficking is considered a hidden population. So hidden population, these are groups of individuals where no sampling frame exists, and there is unknown data with the size and boundaries of this population. So sexual exploitation, this is an example of one of the hidden populations. And there's a lot more research. I won't go through all of this, but I wanted to touch on 3 of them. First, we do see an issue with the lack of human trafficking data out there. Second, the studies that have been done, they see the greatest need for victims of sex trafficking as housing in our communities for these aftercare services. And then third, small nonprofit organizations are overlooked. Oftentimes these larger nonprofits have more decision-making powers, as I mentioned. And as I also showed you, the majority of these nonprofits are small in our communities. So it's important that we involve them. And then technology. We do see, as we're all on Zoom today, technology is becoming more involved with the collaborative process. It's often more low-cost tools that helps us really share the information and learn new things. However, some communities are hesitant to really integrate this technology, and it's important to educate each other on these different tools if we're wanting to help combat human trafficking more effectively. So my research question, the main research question that really led this study was, what are the similarities and differences in how nonprofit organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area, California, and the Salt Lake area, Utah, collaborate in fighting human trafficking with other nonprofits and groups in their communities? So there were 6 subsection questions, 4 main ones. A, what are the challenges nonprofits face as they make an effort to collaborate with other nonprofits? B, what are the challenges nonprofits face as they make an effort to collaborate with public or private sector groups? C, what technology do nonprofits currently use in collaboration? And D, what other nonprofits and secondary groups are these nonprofits collaborating with to help fight human trafficking? So we do see, for example, homelessness, foster care, addiction recovery centers. This is where a lot of the traffickers pull their victims from vulnerable situations. It's important to collaborate with law enforcement and corporations as well. And then E and F, the last 2 questions, were what similarities and differences that existed between the 2 communities with collaboration. So the sample studied instruments and data set. So the sampling group I used, these were registered US nonprofits. I used a criteria sampling approach. So in the US, when a nonprofit registers, they are required to choose an NTEE code. This is the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entity Codes. So this is the focus area. They could choose one, they could choose multiple. And currently there are 400 of these codes. So I reduced it down to 64 of these codes that could potentially be circling around human trafficking. And this is in prevention services, as I mentioned, homeless shelters, foster care systems, helping active victims through medical clinics, awareness programs, exploitation programs, and even aftercare services. This is rehabilitation centers, rape recovery centers. So I did send out emails and a survey to these nonprofits where I did ask them who they partnered with. And if they mentioned a nonprofit that did not exist in my original criteria sampling approach, I then used a snowball sampling approach to outreach to them. So this nonprofit sampling and filtering process. So as you can see here, I did take the nonprofit list from the IRS database from each of these 4 counties in each of these areas, which left me with 36,638 nonprofits in these communities. So I reduced it from the 64 NTEE codes, which left me with 5 to 7% based on the counties. This left 2,015 nonprofits left. I then went through all of these nonprofits and reduced it even further down because they did not exist anymore. They did not have an active online presence, so I could not even find them. So this was reduced down from 29 to 44% in these communities, which left 951. And these are, once again, potential nonprofits. I wouldn't say they actually work with human trafficking, but at this point, they are potential. So as I mentioned, I sent a survey out. I used SurveyMonkey, an online survey tool. And I asked the question of their name, the location they live in. I wanted to know the size of nonprofit, so the annual revenue that they actually took in. I did ask the categories they worked in: prevention, current victims, aftercare services. Oftentimes they worked with multiple. I wanted to know the number of groups they worked with the nonprofit sector, companies, collaborative networks, the frequency that they worked with these groups. I also wanted to know the challenges or the top challenges they had as they worked with each of these through groups, and then the technology tools that they used to collaborate. So I did receive a 3.1 response rate, 29 participants, 22 in California, 7 in Utah. So the description of methodology. This research study was a quantitative study, which I used a descriptive design with a survey-based approach for the purpose of describing variables without a hypothesis or any cause. So the descriptive research is a study structured for participants to illustrate accurate accounts, usually measured once. So the variables were categorical variables. This was allowing for different types, kinds, and elements of collaboration to be analyzed. So I looked at 5 different categorical variables. First, the list of nonprofits working in these fighting human trafficking. Second, the locations they worked in. Third, the number of nonprofits or other groups they worked with a single nonprofit fighting human trafficking. And then fourth, the list of technology tools that they used to collaborate. And then fifth, the frequency that they collaborated. So as I mentioned, I did send out survey emails to 2 locations. So the San Francisco Bay Area, the 4 counties, I listed a map here. And if you're familiar with San Francisco, the west side of these 4 counties, this is the Pacific Ocean. And then in Salt Lake City, these 4 counties, starting up north, Weber County, all the way down to Utah County. And if you're familiar with the Utah area, as you can see in this picture, the east side, this is the mountain range, and the west side, we have the Greater Salt Lake up north, we have Utah Lake down south, and then we have I-80, the main freeway, coming right into Salt Lake County. So using the chat box again, I would love for you to answer, if you can, but can you name one organization in your community who combats human trafficking? Now, I would say a lot of people don't know organizations in their community. Maybe you've heard of organizations in the nation or at all. So I would love to just take a few seconds and just have you jot down if you do know, or maybe you don't know and maybe you put that in the chat box too. So Catholic Charities. If anyone else knows. And I would honestly say, if you're not in this space, a lot of people don't know. All right. Well, I appreciate you answering. So Catholic Charities is actually a really good one. I see 2 more people. Immigration Services, absolutely. National organizations. All right. Well, thank you for even answering. So the statistical analysis, and we'll address those organizations a little later. So the statistical analysis that I really wanted to address, I wanted to look at the average number of nonprofits they worked with, the frequency. So I looked at the mean, the median, and the mode. I also looked at the chi-square test, which is used to determine whether an association or relationship between 2 categorical variables in a sample is likely to reflect a real association between these 2 variables in the population. So the results and analysis. So I looked at really 3 different sections that I wanted to present here. The 3 categories that I mentioned. So we have prevention, we have organizations working with active victims, and we also have aftercare services. And then I wanted to look at the challenges that these nonprofits have as they worked with these groups, and then the technology tools. So here with the size of nonprofit and categories, I found this really interesting. So in California, smaller nonprofits took on, as you see, 67% of the effort in prevention and awareness for human trafficking. They took on 67% of the effort in working with current victims. and 60% of the aftercare services. So as you look at this pie chart, the blue section, these are nonprofits making over $1 million a year. So these are considered larger nonprofits. The orange section here, these are nonprofits making between 50,000 and 1 million. And then we have the gray section. These are nonprofits making under 50,000. Keeping in mind, these are registered nonprofits. So as I mentioned earlier, there are additional charities out there that are not registered that are working in this space as well. So I show this because I think it's important to recognize the importance of these smaller nonprofits are making in our community. Now, as we look at Utah, fewer smaller nonprofits participated in the research study, and I would even suggest potentially even doesn't exist in the efforts of human trafficking. So in Utah, there is one main large nonprofit that really fills this space. They are the decision makers, and it really was reflected in the data here where we see the majority of the effort is done by this larger nonprofit. So the categories that the sample population worked in, we see in California that it was pretty even: prevention, current victims, aftercare services. They were in all three of these areas. In Utah, we see the majority helping current victims. A few percent are working in prevention, and middle is aftercare services. So I also looked at the nonprofits working in these related fields. So in California, the #1 area they worked in was working with at-risk youth programs. And as we see here, the lowest number is drug use addiction. Now, comparing this with Utah, Utah had 4 main areas they really worked with: homelessness, rape recovery, trauma and emergency care, and medical or health care. And once again, foster care and drug use addiction were the lowest. So as I looked at this average, these are number of nonprofits collaborating with a single nonprofit in these areas. So California, this is 14.8. So a single nonprofit on average works with almost 15 other nonprofits when they collaborate. And in Utah, the number is higher. As I mentioned, this is mainly because the majority of the responders were large. They did skew it higher, and the standard error is higher here to 8.28. I also thought it was important to discuss the average number of nonprofits that a single nonprofit collaborates with based on the size of nonprofits. So here in this graph, we do see that I did put more than 2 million here. I wanted to kind of separate it even further down, where the majority of nonprofits are collaborating with over 36 other nonprofits if they make over 2 million. And then we see these nonprofits making under 50,000 a year. So the average that they're working with is 11. These are 11 nonprofits. And if we were to break this down by dollar amount, as you can see on the bottom, these larger nonprofits, they're working with, so every $55,000, they work with one nonprofit. Every almost $4,500, they work with nonprofit. So once again, I think this illustrates the importance of these nonprofits, specifically in this collaborative space, the effort that they're making in our communities. And then specifically with human trafficking, the percentage of nonprofits working in anti-human trafficking based on size. So we see here that the majority are smaller nonprofits in California, and the majority are larger in Utah. So challenges, what are the challenges that these nonprofits face when they collaborate? So this is really one of the areas that I wanted to look at. In California, the top reason why they did not collaborate with other nonprofits was they felt like, or they actually had limited time, 60%. This is followed up by 2 other items. They felt competition or lack of trust with other nonprofits. They also felt like the other nonprofits did not have the same goals. They had different goals. Now, as we compare this with Utah, there was an even number of responses that said limited time and feeling of competition or trust were equal. So we see a higher percent feeling competition or lack of trust when they work in this space with other nonprofits in Utah. Now, these challenges when they worked with companies and community groups. We see here that when a nonprofit works with companies and communities in California, different goals was the #1 reason they did not collaborate. Now in Utah, we did see an even answer of different goals, limited time, limited funds, but we also saw answers of few groups were even in this space to collaborate. And then the last one on challenges, we see the nonprofit collaboration as they collaborated with trafficking networks in their community. California, they said 63% said they did not collaborate because they had limited time. And in Utah, there were 3 equal answers. Limited funds, one, they did say that competition and lack of trust was also there. We also saw a very conflicting response where collaborative groups worked really well together. So it would be interesting to look at this further where we have 2 very opposing responses to their experiences. And then the frequency of collaboration with different groups. So both California and Utah, when they worked with other nonprofits, the majority worked on a weekly basis and collaborated weekly. Now with companies, Utah worked with companies more frequently weekly, whereas California, the majority worked monthly. And then when we look at these anti-trafficking networks that they work with, monthly is usually the majority. California did make an extra effort to work weekly with 31%. Now, when we look at technology, I did use a Likert scale, which is 1 through 5, 1 being the least likely to be used, and 5 most likely to use. So as we see here, the nonprofits are most likely to use email, 75%, when they're collaborating with other nonprofits. And then least likely, 15% said they were least likely to meet in person one-on-one. When we look at Utah, and keeping in mind, this survey went out in the middle of the pandemic last year. So this was in the summer months, June through August is when I really looked at this. So we see the Utah nonprofits were most likely to use the telephone, 80%. And it was interesting here, we also see that 40% said they were most likely to meet in person one-on-one. We also see here least likely, they were least likely 20% to use one-on-one teleconferencing. So this would be Zoom, for example. Would also be interesting to see in future if this is still what's happening. Now, the types of different groups a single nonprofit collaborates with. So we have local community groups as the number 1. This is in both communities. And then we see large corporations and companies being the least for both companies. And also interesting, small businesses are right in the center. It seems like they are more accessible than larger corporations in these communities. So as we look at comparisons, limited time and competition and feeling lack of trust with other nonprofits, these are the top 2 reasons in both communities of why they did not collaborate with other nonprofits. So I did want to discuss the findings and challenges a little further. So as we look at this competition and lack of trust, oftentimes these nonprofits compete for funds. They compete for resources, and resources are often limited in these communities. They also compete for positions within networks. So the next one, the next 2 are really focused on these smaller nonprofits. As I mentioned from the beginning, these challenges, there is a fear of being dissolved, losing autonomy. And then we have larger nonprofits. There is a fear of losing control of the dialogue and the decision-making power ability when they are leading these efforts. So we do see in Utah, as I mentioned, a higher level of feeling of competition and lack of trust. And there is one larger nonprofit, and I thought it's interesting and potentially in the future looking at why there is only one, opposed to other smaller ones coming up and joining the effort. And I came up with 2 potential responses. A, nobody else is willing to fill that space. Or B, smaller nonprofits lose autonomy or are being dissolved. And the research to this point shows that B is really the direction, the reason that is happening. So I think it's being mindful as we work in our communities that when we do collaborate, that these are potential challenges that these small nonprofits have. And then when we look at limited time, So keeping in mind, as I mentioned, 82% of these nonprofits in our communities are small. So a lot of nonprofit leaders have multiple roles, multiple responsibilities. Nonprofits need to look at improving time efficiency. So how could technology help? So as I looked at technology, I did break this down into most time consuming. Oftentimes the phone and in-person meetings are most time consuming. Then we have email and text messaging. These are more time efficient. And as we can see, especially with using Zoom today, newer collaborative tools are being developed, virtual teleconferencing. So based on my research and my findings, Utah fit into this most time-consuming aspect. California was more in this email section. And it's important to further look at technology tools in our communities as we fight human trafficking. So in my research last year, I did look at all of the different collaborative groups that existed in these communities. So in California, I found 5 collaborative groups in these 4 different counties. So as you see on this table, there is a total population in these counties as of last year, 5.1 million people. So that equals 1 coalition per million. Now in Utah, as you can see here, in these 4 counties consisted 2.8 million people. The entire state has 3.2 million. So the majority of the population are in these 4 counties. And with this, there's one coalition called UTIP that exists. It's for the whole state. So that would be 1 per 3.2 million. Now, all last year, I wanted to spend a few minutes here. So all last year, I did try to be involved, or I was involved in 2 of these coalitions, one in California and one in Utah. And I came up with 10 different assessment questions. I do plan on taking this further and researching this further in different communities. So I found this to be a really good base to start. So first I looked at the year they were founded, who funded them, who runs the coalition. So what offices are running this coalition? Who are the decision makers in these coalitions? Is there an annual report? And I looked at their online transparency and their presence. Did they have contact information that was easily accessible so people could reach them? And did they link to their annual report if they had one? And then community meetings. I looked at the frequency, the length, where and how they met. I also looked at the agenda content of the meetings. Number 8, who can participate in these groups? Was this an open community member? Could community members come in? Nonprofit involvement I looked at, as well as locals and our outside community, are they welcome? I looked at the population serviced, as well as the email subscriber list. I thought this was important because this is how they communicated and potentially how participants know about each other. So I wanted to mention a few elements in each of these areas. So San Mateo County, I do address this as an open group approach, and you'll see why as I explain, but this is run by the sheriff's office, and there are 2 coordinators who are also the decision makers. John Vanek, who's the program coordinator, he's a retired police lieutenant from the San Jose Police Department, and then Pamela Estes, who's the advocacy coordinator, who's also an attorney. They do have an annual report. You'll see that on their website specifically for this purpose of human trafficking. And then 7C, the training. What's the agenda and content? They had trainings every month. They did present experts, both local and oftentimes these were experts from outside the area. They discussed cases that were being in the news and potential cases that were active cases that we needed to know about. And they also spotlighted on a monthly basis nonprofits in the group and let them speak, which I thought was great in the way of letting people know about each other. Number 8, who can participate? So this was, anyone was welcome. They walk-ins welcome. I did find out about this group by going online and Google searching them, finding the location and the time, and I walked in. They were very welcoming. I signed my name, made sure I was registered, and then on their emails, and then I participated in the group. I do have to say this was the main reason why I decided to do this research study, is the information I found very helpful in their meetings. And then 10, the email subscriber list. So they had what I call a moderated list where John and Pamela sent out a monthly email. And John told me there were over 300 recipients at the time last year on this list. So if you had an announcement, you would send it to them, they would send it out to the group. And then in Utah, it's called Utah Trafficking in Persons. This is under the Attorney General's office. Now they had one coordinator and a governing body. This is how they structured it. So the admin and coordinator, she schedules and runs the meetings. The governing body, these are the decision makers. I could not find out the names. They weren't transparent online, but I was told that there was a governing body. I was also told that they didn't produce an annual report. The website, they did have an informational page on the Attorney General's page. And then very similar to California, they had trainings. Oftentimes they were from local experts and they did discuss a case or two when I was there. And then 8, their approach for participation was different than California. They had what I called was a task force application process. And every year there's an annual approval process. So they review those every year. And their approach is to include locals only. Number 10, they did have an email distribution list where they CC'd participants. This allowed for the participants to see who else is on the list. And I did, as you can see, I designated 2 different approaches here, open group and a closed group. Now I do want to pose one question. Each community needs to ask themselves, what approach will help victims more effectively? And I think this goes back to my conversation with Sergeant Juan Herveles, where he mentioned really this needs to be, decisions need to be made with a people-based approach and what's needed best for these victims and their communities. So in conclusion, I would say the nonprofit sector really needs to improve collaboration and look at this. Coalitions, there needs to be more effort to increase the nonprofit engagement. As we discussed with competition and mistrust, we really need to start addressing these with the nonprofits as well as community groups if we are to improve human trafficking efforts in our communities. And then aftercare services, this research shows that there is more need for for aftercare services, homeless shelters and legal services, for example. And then with technology, we need to continue to improve technology tools in this effort. So in the future, new ways need to be implemented to 1, help nonprofits collaborate that are more time efficient. 2, help reduce competition or increase trust between nonprofits as they work to combat human trafficking. And 3, we need to engage smaller nonprofits in these collaborative networks. So as I'm looking at future explorations, I came up with 4 different future potential research. So 1, the same research survey could be given to different communities, allowing for comparisons. 2, a deeper research study could be done, a mixed method in the same community, including in-person interviews and really going more in depth. And then 3, a study could be done on the impact small nonprofits have on communities. So do these small nonprofits reach individuals that these larger nonprofits do not reach? And then 4th, as I discussed with these different approaches, a study could be done on closed networks versus open networks, the benefits that exist with the 2, as well as the issues, and specifically with human trafficking focus. So really the main points and the takeaways is 1, small nonprofits work hard to help victims and survivors in our communities. And 2, we really need to find ways to engage these small nonprofits in our communities. And then 3, we need to remember that when we collaborate, we improve outcomes. So as a quick review, the learning objectives here, hopefully you better understand human trafficking and the benefits of collaboration. Hopefully you understand the landscape of the nonprofit sector in the US a little better, and also the challenges these nonprofits face as they collaborate with other nonprofits and community groups. So I wanted to spend the last few minutes here really addressing a practical application that I'm putting together to learn about, for you to learn about a new platform to help these nonprofits collaborate. So it's called Wiki Charities. This is a new online platform to help nonprofits connect and improve collaboration. So really the purpose is, a few of the purposes are to engage small nonprofits, to encourage collaboration. We want a place that's more time efficient to collaborate and find these nonprofits to find each other, as one of the 2013 study mentioned earlier. To increase trust of nonprofits through validation, we're running a validation process. And Wiki Charities, we really hope, is a tool to help in the effort to combat human trafficking. So in my research, there are three main reasons why victims of human trafficking do not get help. First, they're afraid of their trafficker. We also consider this is where the victims also have a trauma bond with the trafficker. Second, there's a lack of trust with authorities. And third, these victims do not know what agencies, what services are out there to help them. So Wiki Charities aims to solve number three. So just a few quotes from a nonprofit in Utah I was recently talking with. Tanya Toole from an organization called Holding Out Help. She works with individuals in these polygamous groups that do want to have a new life. She says, "My biggest issue when I have trafficked victims is the lack of resources out there or that I know of." And then a woman from Tennessee, I work with, Kristen. She works for an organization called Let's Empower. She says, "So many times I have wished for a way to connect with other organizations, but it's a tedious job that requires so much research, filtering, and outreach. I get so focused on our projects and I wear a lot of hats." As we have seen in the research, that these nonprofits are doing a lot of effort. So really the mission statement for Wiki Charities is to provide an online platform where quality charities, one, are searchable by location and topic, two, they show their accountability, and three, they can increase collaboration and access to other tools more effectively to improve the world. So we do have a few minutes, so I'm going to show you the website, but as you can see, the first real focus area is to get nonprofits engaged that are working in the nonprofit efforts. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to reshare. I'm going to show you this website since we have a few more minutes. So wikicharities.org, you can actually go on. We uploaded all 1.5 million nonprofits, it was yesterday, onto this platform, which means you should be able to go in, look up a nonprofit by the location, look up a nonprofit by their name, and soon when we're fully functional, you should be able to go in and look up a nonprofit by the topic. So as you can see here, our taglines are connect, validate, and collaborate. This map is this connection aspect, and it should automatically show up right where you are. And then you do click on the map and it scrolls up to the nonprofit. And so as I mentioned in my research, I eliminated quite a few nonprofits because they did not have an online presence or they did not exist. So we are providing a charity profile page for these nonprofits where they can then input all of their collaborative efforts, the philosophy and approach that they have, and so forth. And then we have this collaborative tool that we'll be researching more this year. This may look like potentially offering a place where they can get funding when they do collaborate. So we're encouraging those collaborative networks. And then one last aspect I wanted to show with human trafficking, since that is my research topic, we want to provide topic pages to start around human trafficking. So as you can see, these are areas that are really connected and proven to be connected with human trafficking: homelessness, human trafficking, pornography, protecting children online, foster care, as examples. So we are looking into what this will look like, what will be helpful for law enforcement. We are looking into trainings, providing resources. So I'm going to reshare my presentation, the last part of my presentation. I appreciate everybody being here, sticking with me through this. So if you did, I do encourage you don't have to go to right now, but can you find the nonprofit that you mentioned, that you know about, or hopefully you will find out about in your community on Wiki Charities? So I do want to end by just posing a question. What can you do? You can really improve awareness in your community, because we do know this is existing everywhere throughout the United States. Find the nonprofit in your community. I encourage you to, for these nonprofits, if they are not on the map, to maybe let us know. I would love to know if these nonprofits are even on our map or searchable, and then really join the efforts in your community. Become aware. And that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate everybody's being here. And does anybody have any questions?
Angie, oh my goodness, what a phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. I mean, my notes page is completely full. So I'm going to, often people may be thinking about maybe a question that they have. I will sort of summarize a little bit of my learnings from your presentation. And now that I know you're German fluent, and we could have actually had a bilingual research symposium today, but we'll stick with the Biannual Research Colloquium instead. And also, I just want to say, we as Aspen are so proud of your work as a student that you did. Because that is like one of the real topics, because it impacts human life. And so just, what you were doing even before you were a student, and then to incorporate your learning as a doctoral student into something that ultimately in some way resulted in you discovering these problems and was the motivation for you to create this Wiki Charities platform. Yeah. And that is genius. I mean, one of the things that I wrote down in my notes, and I put a big giant star next to it, was technology. And I thought that was an interesting concept that we might not ever consider when we try to help people, is the use of technology. I think sometimes, for example, if you're a victim of human trafficking, you might not have access to technology like a cell phone and computers, because they don't want you to get help, you know what I mean? So from that perspective, it would be technology might not help, but for getting people to collaborate, and you have created this Wiki Charities sort of landing page where they can have their own charity profile and people can go there and find those is absolutely genius. Part of what I was thinking when you said technology is they just need a dashboard kind of to go to wherever all the services are, and then, springboard from there. Now, I did notice that your example was California. So I don't know if in the long run you want to expand Wiki Charities to include all the states, or if it already is included. But my goodness, if you loaded in 1.5 million nonprofits just into California,
that's throughout the United States. So as of yesterday, there's actually 1.7 million, because there are quite a few nonprofits that are US expats living around the world. And so they have their nonprofits that are designated throughout the country, or throughout the world. So that's throughout the US.
Yeah, a couple of other sort of tag terms, I guess I would say, or phrases that jumped out at me that help sort of highlight the reality of what we're talking about here. And I was talking with Dr. Holzer before everyone came on, and I mentioned to her that this morning I was watching on Good Morning America, and they actually had a special edition on human trafficking. And they were looking at, Sisters of Mercy and things that they've done. But there was a lady who made a comment, and she says, I don't care if you live in a small town in Iowa. She says, if you have a freeway that goes through your town, a bus station, an airport, you have human trafficking in your community. And that was like, it just stopped me when she said that, because it made it so real that these channels of transporting humans are all around us, and those are sort of the avenues that they have to use to traffic humans. And so that was kind of powerful to me. But I liked how you mentioned too the 3 Ps, and then finally the 4th P, which the 4th P being your emphasis, and that was prevention, prosecution, protection, and then finally partnerships. Another thing that kind of stopped me in my tracks, Angie, when you were presenting, was the 3 different types of exploitation. And we often think of the labor exploitation and the sexual exploitation, but when you listed their organ exploitation, I mean, that really is another moment that stops you in your tracks to say these people aren't just going in, and being forced to do some labor in a factory without pay. we're like farming them for organs in their bodies. And
Mhm.
that is a more sort
Mhm.
of heinous way, I think, of trafficking humans, although none of the other ways are any better, you know.
Mhm.
But you also, I think, a key phrase that you lean to, because it kept making me think, why is California and Utah so different, you know? And I think you mentioned it, that come out of the research, and that is that community-based solutions are key.
Mhm.
In other words, only the communities know their needs and services and the demands of their community. And so for outsiders to maybe come in with this generic copy paste strategy may not be the right approach. And so while California has different needs, they have to approach it differently, and therefore their services and you know, they have many more small nonprofits in California and many large profits, I think one or so in Utah. And so it may be just be because of their communities are different. And that's why I do have sort of a question for Dr. Beeman, if she is still on. I know she has many meetings, and let me see if Nina is still here. She may have jumped off. But anyway, Nina, my question, if you're still on here, is I know that you presented on the approach of forensic science in terms of the pandemic and looking at this concept of victim and perpetrator. And, you know, Angie has presented now some research that involves a perpetrator and a victim. And I was just noticing a similarity there, that forensic approach to solving these two different, you know, challenges, whether it be human trafficking or a pandemic, and that forensic approach being look at a perpetrator and a victim model, may in some ways be the right approach when we try to deal with challenges that interact with humans, and remembering that humans who go through these are victims, even if it's a pandemic. So those were some of my things. Dr. Holzer, I know that that continuum of efficiency was really cool when you put that up and showed how different technology tools have a continuum, where one is more efficient than others, and you're speculating over time that maybe that will change as we become sort of more tolerant of remote interactions through our telecommuting. I do have one question, and it did keep popping up, Angie, that was a challenge for everyone, and that is nobody trusted each other.
Yeah.
And I know you got to the slide there. It says, well, the reasons why is because really they're all fighting for resources. They're afraid to be dissolved, and so they're very protective. But I thought that was interesting that trust in both states was repeatedly a common and dominant theme.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, and I mean, I've been in this nonprofit sector for years and years, and really, to really be sustainable, you need funds. And oftentimes these nonprofits are going after the same foundation, the same funds. So it kind of, the platform and the approach really, you know, it's a competitive approach. So I am really hoping with Wiki Charities to then approach these grant writer or the funders to then encourage collaboration when they do present funding. So I mean, there are different reasons, as I mentioned. Utah, I think, has different reasons to feel competition because there is this dynamic of larger versus smaller. But yeah, competition, and it's been going on for years. So I think it's important to address that when we deal with collaboration.
I don't want to dominate the question conversation section of this session, because I do find this a fascinating topic, and I enjoy talking with, you know, when we find an expert on it and sort of questioning them. But does anyone else have any other, you know, concerns or questions?
So there were a few questions in the chat. So I can answer a few of them. So someone asked who the main one is in Utah. It's the Asian Association of Utah, AAU. You can look them up. And they didn't start out by doing human trafficking. They added a few years after the founding. Somebody else asked, it says, 2 thoughts. Georgia's governors and first lady have identified human trafficking as one of their platforms of improvement in the state and have done tremendous work in the state of education and businesses. That's great. And number 2, with the immigration issue at the border with all the children, trafficking has been something that I have worried about. Yeah. And Dr. Thrasher, so I do have to say that we had discussed at the very beginning what human trafficking looks like. And I think all the experts are really trying to get people to recognize that, you know, this idea of being locked up and chained in a room is not what trafficking looks like. It's oftentimes, you know, these girls or these boys have, or these women and men, they have, they don't understand they're being trafficked, but they are being forced to do something by their parent or their, you know, a boyfriend. And so this is considered human trafficking. And, you know, that trauma bond I mentioned is part of this, right? They have this connection, even though they can't leave, but they can. And so trafficking is more than I think what the media portrays it. And I think it's important to recognize that. And then my last thought of what you had brought up with the removal of organs, it is very horrific. People can go on and kind of look. Wikipedia does a good job on kind of designating them, but research is done, you know, there are countries outside the US that, you know, the traffickers find the vulnerable and then they offer them a small amount of money to, you know, take their kidney, and then they sell it for thousands and thousands of dollars. So, right. So there's just this idea of the using an individual forced or coerced, right? The definition that I had mentioned earlier. So I think it's educating people what trafficking looks like in our communities.
Yeah, you know, the thing that saddens me most about all of this, you know, information is I bet there's an extremely high correlation between those who are trafficked and poverty levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, those who are the most vulnerable and the most sort of weak in our society are the ones that are preyed upon. And
absolutely.
So anyway, I will say that our second presenter for today will continue with this topic of human trafficking, but he will look at it in terms of a countrywide approach and what they're doing in Colombia. And so he has consulted with them. So it'll be interesting to see the overlaps in with Dr. Holzer, and then of course Dr. Sadowski at the next at the half hour of, you know, mark from now. And so does anyone else have any? Looks like there are another message or two. I don't want to miss out on anyone getting an opportunity. Was your research built off of your Wiki Charities, or was it created from your research?
That's a good question. So actually my research, Wiki Charities was an idea I had in the back of my mind that I wasn't doing anything about until I started down this research and the findings, and then I realized it could be a solution for it. So I owned the website for several years. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet. And then it was after my findings that I recognized that the connections were made.
Yeah. If you know that the number one points of exploitation are from Mexico and the Philippines, then you got to have a version of this that people in Mexico and the Philippines can use. So Spanish maybe would be.
So we're actually, I have a group piloting this program in Costa Rica. I'm heading there this summer. So we are moving in that direction.
Yep,
for sure.
Very cool. So that's the only thing that I can see this blowing up to is an international Wiki Charities, where no matter what country you're in, even Cambodia, which has a very high exploitation rate of children, the people can get to these and get help immediately. You know, you almost need like a get help now hotline chat thing as a function. So if I'm an actual victim as opposed to a nonprofit, I know this is really geared towards nonprofits, but there may be a victim section to just say, go to here and ask for someone, and one of the nonprofits manages this chat, you know, 24/7, and they take turns, and you just get someone help who's a victim at that moment.
Yeah, so there's a national hotline that does that for the US. They do a great job. And so I do have to say that I am putting my email here, that please reach out to me. I've seen a few comments about knowing people in Costa Rica. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm happy to have a discussion.
Yeah, you have done some very impressive work on helping humanity, Angie. And so I just want to say thank you as a fellow human.
Well, thank you.
Your work in Africa, your work with folks with HIV, your help with folks who are being human trafficked is obvious a much more rewarding sort of job, even though it's sad. But you know, you're making a difference more than, you know, many of the rest of us who might not have that kind of responsibility in our daily activity. So again,
well,
thank you for being interested in that and putting your attention to these solutions like Wiki Charities.
Well, I do have to say that the faculty at Aspen University has been very supportive, and it was the exact space that I needed to really figure out what I needed. They were really good about letting me go the direction I needed, so I really appreciated that. Someone did ask, how long did it take for me to start and finish my research? So, you know, honestly, because of the pandemic, everything was shut down, so I think it allowed me to do it faster than I would have normally, but it took me about 9 months from beginning to end.
Surveys make things move a little faster.
Okay, that as well. Absolutely.
So, okay, Dr. Holzer, and I hope everybody else, again, will continue to participate in some of the colloquium events. We do have a session here on the upcoming of the mid-hour, and we hope to see y'all there. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a good day.